For years, the name Jeffrey Epstein has hovered over American politics like a shadow nobody wanted to acknowledge. A story filled with unanswered questions, sealed documents, and whispers about powerful people connected through money, influence, and private circles. But this week, something unprecedented happened. Congress stepped in and forced the release of the long-hidden Epstein files, pushing through a bill with overwhelming support and leaving Washington in a kind of stunned silence. Even the way the decision unfolded felt different, almost urgent, as if lawmakers finally realized that the longer these documents stayed sealed, the more the public's distrust grew. And when the bill passed with only a single representative voting against it, the reaction across the country was immediate. People wanted to know what was inside, who was involved, and why these files had been protected for so long. The moment those documents were unsealed, you could feel a shift. Newsrooms scrambled. Analysts started connecting old dots. Victim advocates said this was long overdue. And online the conversation exploded in seconds because now, for the first time in years, the public wasn't dealing with rumors or speculation. They were looking at official records that exposed the inner workings of a case many believed had been buried to protect influential names. These weren't just casual notes. They included travel logs, interview transcripts, internal memos, and communications that painted a picture of a network far bigger than most people expected. And even though parts of the files were heavily redacted, the unsealed portions were enough to fuel a national debate about accountability, transparency, and the frightening ease with which powerful people can avoid scrutiny. In Washington, the mood felt tense. Lawmakers who supported the release framed it as a step toward restoring public trust, while others quietly distanced themselves from the issue entirely. The lone representative who voted against the release found himself under a spotlight he probably didn't expect, with reporters pressing him for answers about why he thought the public shouldn't see these documents. And behind closed doors, you could almost sense a nervous energy, the kind that comes when a city full of political players realizes something big has landed, and everyone is waiting to see where the fallout hits next. But the truth is, this story isn't just about the contents of the documents. It's about why they were sealed in the first place, why victims had to fight so hard for transparency, and why it took Congress intervening at this level to finally bring these files into the light. For many Americans, this moment feels like a turning point, the start of a long process of confronting uncomfortable truths and asking harder questions about how justice works when the people involved have influence most of us can't imagine. And as more details are examined, more names scrutinized, and more connections revealed, one thing has become clear. This release isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a much bigger one. Once people started digging into the newly released Epstein files, the picture that emerged was even more unsettling than many expected. These weren't just scattered notes or loose summaries. They were organized documents that showed patterns, timelines, and connections that had been whispered about for years, but never confirmed through official channels. What caught most people off guard was the level of detail. Travel manifests, listing who flew where and when, handwritten notes from past investigators trying to piece together Epstein's movements, logs with initials and timestamps, and fragments of conversations that raised more questions with every page. Even the redacted portions, covered in thick black ink, spoke volumes about how sensitive this information truly is. You could feel the frustration from readers and analysts alike. It's hard to ignore what's visible while wondering what's still being hidden behind those heavy marks. Inside the documents were sections that made people stop and reread them, especially the parts involving interactions with individuals who had long denied any meaningful connection to Epstein. Some of those denials suddenly sounded thin. There were references to meetings in private residences, unexplained financial transfers, and visits to locations now known to be part of Epstein's operation. For years, defenders had pushed these rumors aside, calling them exaggerated or politically motivated. But now these previously sealed records were showing patterns that couldn't be dismissed so easily. Legal experts began pointing out that even redacted logs can support timelines, and timelines can tell a story without needing to name every character in it. Victim advocates reacted with a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because the official record finally backed up many claims they had been making for years. Frustration because so much could have been addressed sooner if these files hadn't been protected for so long. Several victims' attorneys said the documents confirmed what they had suspected all along, that certain people had access, influence, or proximity that had never been fully investigated, and their reactions weren't emotional outbursts. They were measured, precise, coming from individuals who have spent years navigating a legal system that often seemed designed to protect everyone except the ones who needed protection most. Meanwhile, analysts who study government oversight noted something else: the inconsistencies. The files revealed moments where different agencies appeared to be working off conflicting information, instances where follow-up interviews were never completed, and places where evidence seemed to vanish between one office and another. It raised concerns not only about how the Epstein case was handled, but about the broader system that allowed these gaps to exist at all. When documents show mismatched data between federal departments, people naturally start asking whether those were honest errors or something bigger. Across social media, people began comparing notes, posting screenshots of specific pages, tagging experts, and highlighting fragments that seemed like clues. It became clear that the release of these documents wasn't just an event, it was a catalyst. It pushed people to question the decisions made by those in power, the systems that protected certain individuals, and the reasons behind the silence that lasted for so many years. And as more eyes combed through the files, one undeniable truth emerged. These documents contain far more than just answers. They contain a roadmap to everything that went wrong along the way, and the country is only beginning to unpack what it all means. The moment the documents hit the public space, Washington reacted in ways that almost felt choreographed, yet you could tell nobody really knew how to handle the fallout. Lawmakers who voted for the release stepped in front of cameras with a tone that blended confidence and caution, emphasizing transparency while carefully avoiding any speculation about what the files might imply. They framed their decision as a necessary step toward restoring public trust, something America has been losing in pieces for years. And while their statement sounded polished, the looks on their faces said something different, that they understood these documents were going to raise far more questions than they answered. And those questions could reach places nobody in power wants to revisit. Behind closed doors, aides rushed to gather information, making quiet calls to figure out whether anyone on their side of the aisle had any unexpected ties hidden in old travel logs or social circles. Staffers who usually handled routine scheduling or media prep were suddenly tasked with scanning documents, highlighting mentions, compiling timelines, and cross-checking anything that even hinted at a connection. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. In Washington, even a rumor can change a career. The release of documents tied to one of the most infamous cases in modern U.S. history could reshape entire political landscapes overnight. The one representative who voted against the release faced a different kind of pressure: cameras, questions, and a wave of public curiosity that turned almost instantly into suspicion. Reporters surrounded him each time he stepped into the hallway, asking why he thought the public didn't deserve access, what he knew that others didn't, and whether he was protecting someone. His answers felt rehearsed but thin, insisting that the release could compromise processes and inflame speculation. But for many Americans watching, that explanation only added fuel to the conversation, and soon his vote became a story of its own, separate from the files but tied to them in the most uncomfortable way. Outside of government buildings, reactions didn't come with polished talking points. They came with anger, shock, disbelief, and relief. Victims groups held small gatherings where people shared how surreal it felt to see official documents acknowledging things they had tried to bring forward for decades. Activists filled social media with demands for further transparency. Legal teams began preparing new filings, and you could sense the national mood shifting from curiosity to something more determined, like people were no longer willing to accept partial explanations or comfortable narratives. Commentators on news networks tried to break everything down, often getting lost in the sheer volume of details, while panel discussions turned into heated debates about who failed whom, why the justice system looked the other way for so long, and whether accountability can still exist when the people involved sit at the highest levels of wealth and influence. Every hour brought a new angle: psychological, legal, political, cultural, and every angle led back to the same unsettling realization. This case wasn't mishandled by accident. It was mishandled because too many people had too much to lose. The public could sense that tension. You could feel it in conversations at cafes, in comment sections, in late-night podcasts and call-in shows. Everyone was trying to connect the dots, trying to understand how something this large could stay buried for so long, and whether the release of these documents would finally force the country to confront the deeper failures within the system itself. Washington can spin, minimize, and redirect, but for once, the story wasn't in their control anymore. It was in the hands of millions of people reading the same pages and asking the same uncomfortable questions. As the nation continued absorbing the contents of the Epstein files, a new wave of questions began rising. not just about what the documents revealed, but about what would happen next. People understood that unsealing the files was only the first step. The real consequences, the real accountability, would depend on how leaders, agencies, and investigators responded now that the truth had been dragged into the light. And in that moment, the country felt split between two emotions, a sense of long overdue validation and a quiet fear that, even with all this information out in the open, powerful people might still find ways to escape responsibility. Inside federal agencies, the ripple effects were unmistakable. Teams responsible for oversight, internal review, and ethics compliance suddenly found themselves facing renewed scrutiny. There were calls to examine why certain investigations had stalled and why evidence that should have triggered immediate action sat unnoticed for years. Some officials expressed concern that reopening these paths could expose internal failures, miscommunications, or intentional decisions that allowed the Epstein network to operate with far less pressure than anyone realized. Others argued that confronting those failures openly was the only way to rebuild trust. And in a time when faith in institutions is already fragile, that debate carried a weight that stretched far beyond this one case. Legal experts predicted a wave of new motions and challenges. Victims who had been dismissed or overlooked now had official documents supporting parts of their stories, and many were preparing to move forward with renewed confidence. Attorneys indicated that the release might qualify as newly discovered evidence in some cases, meaning courts could be forced to reconsider past decisions. For survivors who had felt powerless for so long, that possibility alone was monumental. It meant that this wasn't just a symbolic act. It could lead to real legal consequences, real accountability, and real change. In Congress, whispers began circulating about potential hearings. Some lawmakers wanted testimony from investigators who handled the case years ago, asking them to explain the gaps, the delays, and the contradictions found in the files. Others suggested bringing in officials from agencies that had oversight responsibilities, questioning how information could slip through so many cracks. For the first time in a long time, there was an indication that the political world might not be able to simply nod at the documents and move on. With public pressure this intense, ignoring the situation didn't feel like an option anymore. Outside of politics, the impact reached into the culture itself. Documentary teams rushed to update their work. Journalists began planning long-form series. Families who had followed the case for years shared how strange it felt to see something they had discussed privately now being analyzed everywhere, on every network, in every city. And as more people read the documents, more discovered sections that connected previously unrelated details, tiny references, half-sentences, travel timestamps, all forming a larger picture that had been hidden for far too long. Social media took on a life of its own, transforming the files into a nationwide crowdsourced investigation. People posted side-by-side comparisons, created independent timelines, connected statements from different years, and pointed out inconsistencies in earlier public denials. It wasn't chaos. It was something closer to collective analysis. For once, the country wasn't waiting for an official narrative. They were building one of their own from the pages released in front of them. But beneath all the noise, all the angles, and all the commentary, something deeper was shifting. For many Americans, this wasn't just a scandal involving powerful names. It was a reminder of how fragile the idea of justice can be when the stakes are high and the people involved operate far above the level of ordinary life. It was a reminder that systems meant to protect the vulnerable often bend under pressure from those with influence, and that secrecy thrives when accountability is treated like a threat rather than a responsibility. And yet, this moment also carried a sense of possibility. The release of the Epstein files proved that public pressure could force transparency, even on a story that some believed would never see daylight. It proved that voices demanding the truth, no matter how small they once seemed, could grow loud enough to reach the halls of power. And it showed that even the most carefully guarded secrets can eventually be confronted. As the country waits for the next steps, the hearings, the investigations, the legal actions, the public testimony, one thing has become clear. This isn't just the reopening of an old case. It's a turning point in how the nation understands power, accountability, and the cost of silence. And whether Washington wants it or not, the demand for answers isn't fading. It's growing, and it's not going away until every part of this story is finally brought into the open.